The day Evelyn Dugan buried her husband was the same day the cottonwood tree on the western ridge bloomed white as a bridal veil, which she always thought was either the cruelest joke God had ever told or the most tender mercy he had ever offered, and she could never quite decide which. It was the spring of 1873, out in the wide, sun-bitten country of central Texas, where the land rolled and creased like an old quilt, and the sky went on forever in every direction without apology. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat at the edge of a shallow river that ran copper-colored after the rains, and it was a town like 100 other towns that had sprung up along the cattle routes: a general store, a livery, a two-room schoolhouse, a church with a bell that stuck in cold weather, and a scattering of homesteads stretching out in every direction like seeds thrown from an open hand. Thomas Dugan had been 31 years old and full of plans. He had been the kind of man who rose before the sun and worked past the moon and laughed easily between those two hard bookends of labor. He had built their house himself, fitted every plank and notched every joint, and he had told Evelyn while hammering the last nail into the porch rail that this house would stand 100 years if they loved it right. She had believed him. She had believed everything he said in those days, not out of naivety, but because Thomas had a way of making the possible feel inevitable. The fever came without warning in the way that fevers do. One morning he was splitting wood in the yard, shirt damp at the collar, calling out to Evelyn that they would need 2 more cords before winter. By nightfall he was shaking under 3 quilts. By the 4th day the doctor from Harlan's Crossing, a weathered man named Pell who smelled of camphor and sad resignation, told Evelyn in the quiet hall outside the bedroom that there was nothing more medicine could offer. She had held the doorframe to stay upright. She had not cried in front of Dr. Pell. She had walked back into the bedroom, sat beside Thomas, taken his burning hand in both of hers, and she had stayed there. He died on a Tuesday morning, with the window light falling golden across the blankets. Evelyn was 28 years old, the mother of a 7-year-old boy named Sam, and she was suddenly, bewilderingly, the sole keeper of 40 acres, a house Thomas had loved into existence, a milk cow named Bess, 4 chickens, and a sorrow so large she could not find the walls of it. The neighbors helped with the burial. Women from town brought food that she could not eat. The preacher spoke words that she heard as if through deep water. And when everyone had gone home and the October stars were coming out above the ridge, Evelyn wrapped herself in Thomas's coat, took the small pocket knife he kept on the shelf by the door, and walked up through the dry grass to the cottonwood tree on the western ridge. She had not planned what she was going to do. She simply walked until she arrived at the tree, that great old cottonwood that Thomas had loved to sit beneath on summer evenings when the work was done. And she pressed her palm flat against the bark and felt the rough reality of it, solid and alive, and indifferent to grief in the way that only living things can be. Then she opened the knife and slowly, with great deliberateness, she carved his name into the bark. Thomas Dugan. She carved each letter carefully, pressing deep so that the name would not fade with the seasons. Her hands shook, but she did not stop. When she was finished, she held the flat of the blade against the letters, and the bark was pale and fresh around the cuts, and she stood there in the dark with the wind moving through the high branches, and she said his name aloud once, just once, so that the night could hold it too. She did not cry that night. She did not cry for 3 weeks, and then one afternoon she was mending one of Sam's shirts, and she found one of Thomas's vest buttons rolled into the seam of her sewing basket, a small brass button she did not even remember having, and she sat on the kitchen floor and cried until she could not breathe. And then she breathed again, and she kept going, because Sam needed supper and Bess needed milking, and the world was unreasonably, stubbornly committed to continuing. The years after Thomas's death moved the way years do when you are keeping yourself alive through sheer will, slowly in the hard moments and shockingly fast in the ordinary ones. Evelyn learned to do the things Thomas had always done. She hired a boy from town named Cleet for the heaviest fence work when she could spare the coin. She traded eggs for flour at the general store. She taught Sam how to split kindling without losing a finger, how to read a weather sky, how to be gentle with the cow and firm with strangers. Sam grew in the way that children grow in hard country, lean and steady and older in the eyes than his years suggested. By the time he was 10, he was doing the work of a much older boy without complaint. He had his father's coloring, that sandy brown hair and those gray-green eyes, and sometimes when he tilted his head a certain way, Evelyn had to look at a point somewhere past him until the resemblance settled into something she could carry instead of something that cut. They were not rich, but they were not desperate. The land gave what it gave, and Evelyn was careful with everything it offered. She grew a kitchen garden of real size, kept more chickens than before, and eventually, in the summer of 1876, she planted a small apple orchard along the south fence line because Thomas had always wanted one, and she decided that wanting something on behalf of the dead was not the same as living in the past. It was a way of keeping a conversation going that had ended too soon. The town of Harlan's Crossing grew around them during those years. New families came in on wagons from Tennessee and Missouri and as far as Virginia. A second general store opened. The old church got a new bell that worked in all weather. A cattle operation took up the land to the north of Evelyn's homestead, a proper ranch, with bunkhouses and a corral and longhorns that wandered sometimes to the fence line, and regarded Evelyn's apple trees with the calm philosophical interest of animals that have no concept of property. The ranch was called the Double C, and it had changed hands twice in the years since Evelyn had been on her land. The first owner had been a speculator from back east who had lasted 18 months before the reality of ranching reduced him to a letter of defeat sent to a land broker in San Antonio. The second had been a capable enough man named Briggs who had run the operation respectably for 4 years before a bad winter, and a dispute with the railroad over cattle rates had pushed him into selling. The third owner arrived in the late summer of 1877. Evelyn heard about him before she saw him, the way you hear about most things in a small town, in the form of information that arrives at your ears whether you want it or not. She was at the general store, run by a square-built woman named Martha Ennis, who had opinions about everything, and kept them in a state of constant readiness like a woman, keeping rifles loaded on a mantelpiece. Man named Harvey Cooper bought the Double C, Martha said, handing Evelyn her paper-wrapped salt without being asked for her editorial on the matter, then providing it anyway. From up near Abilene, they say. Ran a good-sized operation up there before some trouble with flooding, I heard. He's about 34, 35, not married. Brought 2 hands with him and is apparently hiring more. She paused for the effect she clearly intended. A single man with a working ranch. The ladies of this town will take a very specific kind of notice. Evelyn tucked the salt into her basket. That's his business and theirs, she said pleasantly. Martha gave her a look that communicated without words that Evelyn's pleasantness on the subject was either admirable or a waste of a good opportunity, and possibly both. Evelyn walked home through the afternoon heat thinking about her apple trees and the fence on the south side that needed 2 new posts, and the fact that Sam had outgrown his only good boots, and she did not think about Harvey Cooper at all. She saw him for the first time 10 days later. She was at the fence line on the north side of her property, the side that bordered the Double C's pasture land, trying to determine whether the fence post she was examining was savable with bracing or needed to come out entirely. The longhorns had pressed against this section repeatedly, and the post had developed an opinion about leaning that Evelyn did not share. She heard the horse before she saw it, hooves in dry grass coming from the north at an easy walk. She straightened up from examining the post and shaded her eyes. The man rode a dark bay horse with a blaze down its nose, a big animal that moved with the relaxed authority of a horse that has been well handled and knows it. The man himself was tall in the saddle, that particular kind of tall that came from years on horseback, a settled, undemonstrative height that had nothing to prove. He wore a plain brown coat gone soft at the elbows, a hat that had clearly been chosen for function rather than impression, and he had the kind of face that the Texas sun made an honest project of, weathered at the corners of the eyes and along the jaw, the sort of tan that did not come from leisure. He pulled the bay up a polite distance from the fence, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I apologize if my animals have given you trouble with this line." His voice was low and even, with the flatness of the northern plains smoothed into it. "I noticed when I rode the boundary this morning that there's been some pressure on your posts along this stretch. I wanted to come by directly and tell you that I'll see to it from my side." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, then looked at the leaning post. "I appreciate that. The post on this end is going to need replacing regardless, but I'd be grateful if you kept them from pressing the section by the southwest corner. That fencing is older and it won't take the same persuasion twice." Something shifted at the edge of his expression that was not quite a smile but was in that general neighborhood. "I'll see to it." "I'm Harvey Cooper. I took on the Double C about 2 weeks ago." "I know," Evelyn said, then felt mildly that she should have been less direct about it. "Martha Ennis at the store mentioned it. I'm Evelyn Dugan. My husband built this property. I run it now." She watched him absorb the information without rearranging his face into the particular configuration of sympathetic condescension that some men offered when they realized a woman was running a property alone. He simply nodded, as if it were a reasonable arrangement, which it was. "If you need any hands for heavy work and can't spare the cost, come find me. I've hired 3 good men and they'll have down time between the drives. It's no trouble to spare labor for a neighbor." "That's kind," Evelyn said, meaning it. "I may take you up on that for the apple trees on the south side. I planted them 3 years back and the deer have decided they belong to them." He did look at her then with genuine interest. "Apple trees out here." "Thomas always wanted them," she said simply. "He didn't get to see them planted, so I planted them." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Harvey Cooper looked at the fence post again, then back at her. "I'll send my man Caleb over about the deer fence. He's good with that kind of work, and it'll give him something useful to do on a slow week." He touched his hat brim again, and turned the bay horse in the easy way of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and rode back toward the Double C at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived at. Evelyn watched him go for just a moment longer than strictly necessary, then went back to examining her fence post. True to his word, he sent Caleb, a wiry young man from New Mexico who attacked the deer fencing around the apple trees with cheerful efficiency, 3 days later. And he sent word through Caleb that if the southwest corner section was giving trouble, Caleb would look at that too before he rode back. Evelyn let Caleb look at it, and he pronounced it fixable with new posts and 2 hours of work, and he fixed it. And he refused anything more than the noon meal Evelyn set out for him, saying that Mr. Cooper had said the labor was a neighborly offering and not a thing to be paid for. Evelyn thought about Harvey Cooper more than she had expected to. Not in the way she had thought about men occasionally in the years since Thomas, in that distant, sealed-off way, like regarding a painting through a locked window, but in a more immediate way, which unsettled her enough that she set it aside and concentrated on the apple trees. She saw him again at the harvest social in October, the first of those big communal gatherings that the town organized each autumn, partly for practical reasons of shared labor, and partly because the isolation of ranch and homestead life created in people a hunger for each other's company that could not be entirely satisfied by a once-weekly church service. The harvest social was held in the barn belonging to Ed and Louise Crane, who had the largest barn in the county and the generosity to open it twice a year for exactly this purpose. People came from a wide radius, bringing food and fiddle players and children, and the particular energy of people who have been working hard in relative solitude and are now delighted to be loud and social in a group. Evelyn came with Sam, who was by now 11, And at that age where the distance between having fun at a social and deciding socials were too childish for him was constantly shifting. He arrived wanting to find his friend Decker, who was the blacksmith's son and his closest companion, and spent most of the evening in the general chaos of boys his age, which was its own small wild country operating independently of the adult gathering. Evelyn talked with Louise Crane and with the new schoolteacher, a young woman named Bertie Walsh who had come from Ohio and was still finding her footing in the specific social landscape of a Texas cattle town, and who was bright and curious, and sometimes looked at the dried plains around Harlan's Crossing with the uncertain expression of someone who had agreed to a thing and was still deciding what they thought of it. Harvey Cooper arrived about an hour into the evening with his two regular ranch hands, brothers named Caleb and Dade Rourke, and a third man, bigger and quieter, introduced around as Whitmore. Harvey moved through the social with the ease of a man who is comfortable in groups without needing to dominate them, shaking hands, accepting food offered by the ladies of the town with genuine appreciation, talking cattle and weather and fence line with the ranchers and homesteaders in the dense, practical shorthand of men who work the same land. He found Evelyn near the food table about 90 minutes into the evening, appearing at her elbow with a kind of natural ease that suggested he had been making his way in her direction without making a production of it. "Mrs. Dugan," he said, "how did Caleb do with the deer fence?" "He did excellently," she said. "You should be proud of the standard you've set for work. He didn't cut a single corner. I'll tell him. It'll mean something coming from you." He helped himself to a piece of Louise Crane's cornbread and chewed it thoughtfully. "These apple trees, how many have you got?" 14. "I lost 2 in the summer of '75 to blight, but the other 14 have been steadfast." She found herself warming to the subject in the way she always did. "I have 5 varieties. 2 winesap, 4 Ben Davis, 3 yellow bellflower, 3 Roxbury russet, and 2 that were mislabeled by the nursery man in San Antonio, and I still don't know what they are. They produce the smallest, most perfect little yellow apples you have ever seen." He was looking at her with a focus that she registered but tried not to put too much stock in. "You know a great deal about apples." "I know a great deal about these specific apples," she said. "I studied whatever literature I could find. The Farmer's Almanac has been very useful. A woman in Bixar County wrote me a long letter about winesap pruning after I wrote to a publication asking about it. I've never met her, but I feel a considerable debt to her expertise." "That's a good kind of community," Harvey said. "Long distance and agricultural." She laughed, which surprised her slightly. It came out naturally, without the half-second decision she was used to making before allowing herself to laugh in mixed company. She had got careful about that over the years without entirely realizing it. They talked for another half hour about the land, about the river running lower than it should this late in the year, about whether the new schoolhouse addition would be finished before the cold came in. Sam found her during this time, hauled Decker over to be inspected, got fed 3 pieces of pie by various adults, and was permitted to stay up considerably past his usual hour in the general festive exception that such evenings created. Walking home later under a sky thick with October stars, Sam between her and the darkness, Evelyn thought about the way Harvey Cooper had listened when she talked, fully, without the restless edge of a man waiting for his own turn to speak, and she thought about how long it had been since she had laughed without deciding to first. She walked the last quarter mile singing quietly to herself, an old hymn Thomas had liked, and the night air tasted of wood smoke and cold grass and something she cautiously identified as possibility, which she then tucked away carefully, the way you tuck a lit candle into a lantern glass before walking into the wind. Through that winter and into the following spring, Harvey Cooper became a fixture of Evelyn's life in the way that a person can become a fixture without any single moment of decision. Gradually, through accumulation, through the repeated small gravity of 2 lives in proximity. He came to check the fence line in November and stayed to help Evelyn reshore the damaged corner of her root cellar, which had shifted in the fall rains and was letting cold air in on her winter stores. He brought Caleb with him, and the three of them worked through the afternoon, while Sam held tools and asked questions that Harvey answered with the patience of a man who believed that a boy asking questions deserved honest answers. In December, when a cold snap came in hard and fast from the north, and the river froze for the first time in 6 years, Harvey sent a supply of extra firewood with Dade Rourke along with a note written in a plain, careful hand that said only, "Winter came sooner than expected. Thought you might need this before you had the chance to send for more. H.C." Evelyn read the note twice. Then she wrote back, thanking him, and added at the bottom in her own more elaborate hand, "The apple trees look remarkable in the ice. You should ride by and see them if you are ever that way." He rode by the following Sunday after church and looked at the apple trees, which did look remarkable, each small branch gloved in clear ice, the whole orchard catching the thin winter light and scattering it in 100 directions. He stood at the fence gate with his breath making clouds and his hat in his hands, looking at the trees, and Evelyn watched him from a slight distance and felt something open quietly in her chest, like a window being raised in a room that has been closed for a long time. Thomas would have liked this, she heard herself say. Harvey turned to look at her unhurried, without any trace of discomfort at the mention of her husband's name. "Tell me about him," he said, "if you don't mind." No one had asked her that in years. People mentioned Thomas with care and circumspection, as if his name were a bruise to be pressed lightly or avoided entirely. Harvey Cooper was asking her to talk about him the way you ask someone to tell you about a person they loved, with genuine interest in the answer. She talked about Thomas for almost an hour. She told Harvey about how Thomas had come out from Tennessee at 22 with $40 and a specific, unshakable conviction that the Texas Hill Country was where he was meant to be. She told him about how Thomas had built the house board by board, how he had measured and remeasured everything 3 times, because he said a thing worth building was worth building right. She told him about the apple tree conversation, how Thomas had sat on the porch one summer evening and said, very seriously, that the one thing this property lacked was an apple tree with a broad enough canopy to sit under in the afternoon, and how she had teased him about being a man with pastoral ambitions above his station, and how he had laughed and said that was exactly right. Harvey listened to all of it with his hat in his hands and the cold air making quiet work between them, and when she was finished, there was a silence that felt clean rather than empty. "He sounds like a man who knew what he had," Harvey said quietly. "He did," Evelyn said. "He told me so often enough that it became the thing I miss most, that he knew." She had not said that to anyone before, and the truth of it surprised her a little, landing with the small weight of a thing recognized for the first time even though it has always been true. The spring of 1878 came in warm and early, and the apple trees put out blossoms of such extravagant abundance that Evelyn stood among them on the first really warm morning in March, and felt a completeness she could not entirely account for. Sam turned 12 and was now taller than her left shoulder, and had the beginning of opinions about things that made her want to laugh and argue in equal measure, which she suspected was exactly the correct response to a 12-year-old. Harvey Cooper came to dinner for the first time in April. Evelyn had invited him plainly, without ceremony, saying that she was making a proper meal on Sunday, and that it seemed a waste of a good apple pie not to have someone to share it with, and he had accepted with the same directness, saying he would bring the coffee since he had a good supply and would not hear of coming empty-handed to a meal. He came on a Sunday when the light lasted long, and the evening was soft with the smell of new grass. He sat at the table Evelyn set, and ate the meal she cooked: roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, cornbread, the apple pie made from the first preserved apples of the previous autumn, with the genuine appreciation of a man who has been eating camp food and his own rough cooking for too long. He and Sam talked about horses for most of the first part of the meal, and Evelyn watched her son animate in a way he sometimes did not with strangers, leaning forward in his chair and asking Harvey questions about the Double C's horses with the focused intensity of a boy who had decided that horses were the most serious subject in the world and expected to be taken seriously on the point. Harvey obliged him completely. He described each of the horses in his operation with the same specificity that Evelyn brought to her apple varieties, and this parallel was not lost on her, and it settled something in her that had not known it was unsettled. After supper, when Sam had been sent to bed with less argument than usual, he had worn himself to comfortable tiredness with the conversation. Evelyn and Harvey sat on the porch with coffee and the last of the evening. The sky was a deep layered blue going to black at the horizon, and the first stars were coming in, and the cottonwood tree on the western ridge was a dark shape against the lighter sky. Harvey looked at the ridge. "What's up there?" Evelyn followed his gaze. "A cottonwood tree. It's very old. Thomas used to sit under it on summer evenings." She paused. "I carved his name in the bark after the autumn he died. It seemed important to mark that he had been there, that the place held him." Harvey was quiet for a moment. "I think that's one of the most honest things I've ever heard." She looked at him sideways. The porch light was the warm orange of a good lamp, and it showed his face in profile, the line of his jaw, the particular set of his mouth, the way he held very still when he was thinking something through. "You've been lonely," she said, and she meant it as a thing she had observed with care, not as an accusation or a presumption. He turned to look at her then, and something in his face was unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "Yes," he said simply. "I have." "I have too," she said. "I had become accustomed to it. I was not certain that could change." He looked at her steadily. "Are you certain now?" "I am becoming less uncertain," she said, which was the truest answer she had. The corner of his mouth moved in that way it had, the not-quite smile that she had learned was, in fact, a real smile for him. He was simply a man who carried his expressions close. "I can work with that," he said. She laughed again, that easy laugh, and the stars came fully in above the ridge, and the cottonwood tree was a dark, patient shape against the sky, and the evening went on for a long time before either of them thought to end it. What followed through that spring and summer was a courtship that moved at the pace of two people who have been around long enough to know that haste is not the same as certainty. Harvey came to Sunday dinner regularly, and Evelyn began visiting the Double C occasionally, riding out on Sunday afternoons to see how the ranch was taking shape under his stewardship. Because it was taking shape, visibly and impressively, the neglect of the previous two owners giving way to the order and energy of a man who knew what he was doing and cared about the doing of it. She met his men properly. Caleb Rourke was 23 and quick and funny, and treated Evelyn with the easy respect of a man who had been raised right. His brother Dade was 26, quieter and more deliberate, a brilliant horse handler. Whitmore, whose first name turned out to be Abe, was 40 and had worked ranches from Wyoming to the Rio Grande, and had the economy of a man who has done everything twice and knows which part matters. Sam took to the Double C with the full force of a 12-year-old boy, encountering a proper working ranch for the first time. Harvey let him observe the horses with the seriousness Sam wanted, and Caleb, who was good with young people, took him on as a kind of unofficial apprentice during visits, teaching him small things about horse care and tack work that Sam absorbed like the driest ground absorbs the first rain. In June, Harvey asked Evelyn if he might have permission to speak directly about his regard for her. They were sitting in the shade of the big oak behind the Double C's main house, drinking cold water from the pump, having spent the morning doing the completely unromantic work of evaluating the fencing on the eastern side of the property that Harvey thought needed replacing. Evelyn had been helping him assess it because she had opinions about fencing that she had arrived at through hard experience and was not shy about sharing. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. He told her that in the time he had known her, he had come to regard her more than he had regarded anyone in a long time, that he was not a man who spoke carelessly about such things, and that he wanted her to know where he stood so that she could decide where she stood, and that he would not be offended or change his behavior toward her whatever she decided, because she was his neighbor and his friend, and those things stood on their own without requiring anything further from her. Evelyn listened to all of it. She had known it was coming, had been tracking the quiet momentum of the previous months with the careful attention she brought to everything important, and she had been having a long, honest conversation with herself about it in the privacy of her own thinking. She told him that she had loved Thomas deeply and completely, and that this would always be true, that it was not a truth that competed with other truths but simply existed alongside them. She told him that she had not expected to find herself in this position, caring for a man, feeling the pull of someone else's company, wanting things she had filed away as belonging to a previous life. She told him that she was not afraid of those feelings but that she intended to move slowly, because she had a son to consider, and because she was the kind of person who needed to be sure. Harvey said that he understood entirely, and that slow was fine with him, that he was not going anywhere and had no intention of crowding her into anything. She nodded, and they went back to evaluating the fencing, and the directness of it made her feel steadier than any elaborate courtship ritual could have done, because it was honest and mutual and treated her as a person with full agency in her own life, which was exactly what she needed. The summer deepened around them. Harvey rode over not just on Sundays now, but on occasional Wednesday evenings, and Evelyn sometimes rode out to the Double C on her own, not always with Sam, which was its own quiet acknowledgement of something. They talked about everything, the cattle market and the weather and the state of the southern fence line, and what Sam was reading in school, and whether the new telegraph line coming through would change the cattle business. And somewhere inside all those practical conversations was a continuous thread of something more personal that grew slowly stronger without needing to announce itself. One Wednesday evening in late July, Harvey came to dinner, and afterward they sat on the porch as they often did, and the cottonwood tree on the western ridge was dark against the late summer sky, and Evelyn, moved by some impulse she didn't fully analyze, said, "Would you like to see it? The tree where I carved his name." Harvey looked at the ridge and back at her. "If you'd like to show me." They walked up through the warm evening grass in the last of the daylight, side by side without touching. The ridge was not steep, but the grass was thick, and the ground had the give of ground that has been rained on and dried and rained on again 100 seasons, and the cottonwood was bigger than it looked from the porch, enormous up close, the bark deeply furrowed, and the canopy spreading wide enough to make its own evening inside the larger evening. Evelyn found the place where she had carved the name and put her hand on it. The letters were still clear. 4 years on, she had cut them deep enough to last, and the bark had grown slightly around the edges of each letter so that the name was settled and permanent, part of the tree now. Thomas Dugan. Harvey stood beside her, not crowding her, one arm's length away, and looked at the name in the bark. He was quiet for a long time, and she appreciated the quality of that silence. It was the silence of someone actually feeling something rather than performing consideration. "He is here," Harvey said finally, not in a mystical way but in the straightforward way of a man who was acknowledging a reality. "In this place, in this tree, in you and in Sam. He is here." Evelyn traced the letters with her fingertip. "I needed him to be here in a way I could see. Is that a strange thing?" "No," Harvey said, and the certainty in his voice was so clean it almost hurt. "It is the most natural thing in the world." She lowered her hand from the letters and looked at the wide plain below the ridge, where the homestead sat in its bowl of lamp light, and the Double C was visible in the distance to the north, a scatter of lights in the darkening land, and she felt the two lives, the one she had built in grief, and the one that was asking to begin sitting beside each other as naturally as two names carved side by side in a tree, which was not a thought she had yet, but was one that was quietly preparing itself. The fall of 1878 brought a situation that neither Evelyn nor Harvey had anticipated, and it arrived in the form of a man named Garrett Cole. Cole was a cattle broker from San Antonio who had been buying up land and cattle rights across the county for 2 years, acquiring properties from homesteaders and small ranchers who were having difficult seasons and persuading them to sell before they were ready. He was not a violent man, not in the direct way of the cattle wars stories that reached even Harlan's Crossing from other parts of the state, but he was a man who used legal instruments and financial pressure with the same effect as a more aggressive kind of persuasion. He came to Evelyn's homestead on a Thursday in September with a paper offer to buy her land at a price that was below what it was worth, but not insultingly so. It had clearly been calibrated to be just attractive enough to tempt a woman in her position, one who ran 40 acres alone and had a boy to consider. Evelyn read the offer carefully. She thanked Cole for his time and told him she would consider it, which was the polite answer that bought her time to think rather than a commitment in either direction. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The land was not just land to her. The house was Thomas's house, built board by board with his hands. The apple trees were the ones she had planted in his memory. The cottonwood on the ridge had his name in it. Selling the land would not have been only a financial transaction. It would have been a dissolution of something she had no interest in dissolving. But she was also a practical woman, and she could see what Cole was doing, and she knew enough about the pattern of what had happened to other small landholders in the county to know that his offer, if refused, would likely not simply evaporate. Men like Cole found other points of pressure. She rode to the Double C the following morning. Harvey listened to everything she told him about Cole's offer with the focused attention he brought to problems. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Cole had come to the Double C 2 months earlier with a similar approach, offering to buy a portion of the eastern grazing land, and that he had declined. "He'll come back," Harvey said. "Men like that don't take a first refusal as a final answer. They look for where you're weak and they press there." "Where am I weak?" Evelyn asked directly. Harvey met her eyes. "You're not weak. But you're alone, and he knows that 40 acres managed by a single woman with a boy can hit a season hard enough that a cash offer looks like relief. He's waiting for that season. Then I need to make certain that season doesn't come," she said. They talked for 2 hours about it, practical, specific talk about how Evelyn could strengthen her position, what alliances she had in town, what legal recourse existed if Cole tried anything less than above board, how the ranching and farming community could be mobilized if it needed to be. Harvey knew more about the legal structures involved than she expected, and when she asked about it, he told her that he had dealt with a land dispute in his previous operation in Abilene and had come out of it knowing more about land law than he had ever wanted to. Over the following weeks, Harvey quietly spoke to Ed Crane and to several other landholders in the county, not to organize opposition so much as to make certain that people were aware of what Cole was doing in the aggregate, that it was not isolated transactions but a systematic acquisition that was reshaping who owned what in the county and in whose interests. The preacher, Reverend Adcock, who had a more political sensitivity than the average man of the cloth, made certain remarks from the pulpit on a Sunday that addressed the subject without naming names in a way that nevertheless named names. Cole returned to Evelyn's homestead in October with a revised offer. It was marginally better than the first. She told him, pleasantly and without heat, that her land was not for sale and that she expected him to respect that. He looked at her with the flat assessment of a man measuring an obstacle, and she held his gaze without flinching until he tipped his hat and left. He did not come back after that. Whether it was the community pressure or Harvey's quiet conversations or simply the calculation that the acquisition was not worth the social cost in a town where people talked, she never knew with certainty, but the land remained hers. She told Harvey this when she rode over to report the outcome, and he looked genuinely relieved, which she noticed. "I was going to fight it if he pushed further," Harvey said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't just your problem." She looked at him across the fence line between their properties, the November sky wide and pale above them. "I know," she said. "Thank you." "I have a personal interest in your 40 acres remaining in your hands," he said, and the way he said it, the personal carrying more weight than the practical, made the air between them change slightly. "Harvey," she said quietly. "Evelyn," he said back with the same quiet, and the word was ordinary in every way and everything at the same time. He came to Christmas dinner that year. It was the first time Harvey had been at Evelyn's table for a proper holiday meal, and she made the event worthy of it. A proper roasted goose that she had been thinking about since October, sweet potato pie, preserved apple tarts from the last of her summer supply, bread that she had been tending since 4 in the morning. Sam set the table without being asked, which was not his habit, and wore his good shirt, which was also not his habit, and managed to look both self-conscious about caring and unable to help caring, which Evelyn found entirely endearing. Harvey arrived with coffee, as always, and also with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper for Sam that turned out to be a proper pocket knife, a good one with a bone handle, the kind a man could use for real work. Sam's face went through approximately 6 emotions in 2 seconds before landing on a gratitude so genuine it was almost shy, which Evelyn had never seen on her son before, and which meant something considerable to her. For Evelyn, Harvey had brought a small book, a volume on pomology, the science and art of apple cultivation, that he had ordered through a bookseller in San Antonio. It was a good book, serious and detailed, and inside the front cover he had written in his plain, careful hand, "For the woman who proved that apple trees belong in Texas. H.C." She held the book for a long moment, reading and rereading that inscription, and then looked up at him, and he was watching her with that expression she had come to know, that close-held warmth, and she said, "This is the finest present I have received in a very long time." "You're welcome," he said simply, and that was all that needed to be said. After dinner, while Sam was absorbed in examining every aspect of the new pocketknife with the thoroughness of a boy discovering a new religion, Evelyn and Harvey sat by the fire and talked until late, and at some point the conversation moved from the practical to the personal in the way it did now with some regularity, and Harvey said, in the direct way he said everything important, "I would like to ask you to marry me, Evelyn. Not right now, if you need time. But I want you to know that I'm asking, and that I mean it, and that there is no pressure in the asking, only hope." She had been watching the fire while he spoke, and she kept watching it for a moment after he finished. She thought about Thomas, she always did, and Harvey had never asked her not to, which was one of the things she loved about him. She thought about the cottonwood tree, and the name carved in the bark, and the weight of grief, and how grief was not the same as love, and love was not the same as disloyalty, and how a heart was not a house with only so many rooms but something that expanded to accommodate what it needed to hold. She turned to look at him. "Give me until spring," she said. "Not because I am uncertain about you, but because I want to arrive at yes in the right way." "Spring," he agreed, without a flicker of disappointment, only that steady, patient attention that was so particularly his. January and February were cold and busy with the work of winter, keeping the stock healthy and the root cellar sufficient, and the house warm, and Evelyn's private life ran underneath all of it like a deep current, warm and deliberate and sure. She wrote letters to her sister in Missouri, the first time in 2 years she had written at any real length. She talked to Reverend Adcock, not about remarriage specifically, but about how a person holds a grief and a future in the same hands without dropping either, and he was more thoughtful and less formulaic about it than she had expected. She talked to Sam. That was the hardest conversation and the most important one. Sam was 12, nearly 13, old enough to have real feelings about things and young enough that those feelings could run in several directions at once. Evelyn sat with him one evening after supper when the lamp light was good and the house was quiet, and she told him plainly that Harvey Cooper had asked her to consider marrying him, and that she was considering it, and that she wanted to know how Sam felt before she decided anything. Sam was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands, then at the window, then at his mother. "Do you love him?" he asked. "I believe I do," she said. "In a way that has grown slowly and honestly, and has not asked me to forget your father, which I could not do and would not want to." Sam nodded. He turned his pocket knife over in his hands, the one Harvey had given him for Christmas. "He listens to me," Sam said finally, "not like he's waiting to be done listening, actually listens." "He does," Evelyn agreed. "Papa did that too," Sam said, and there was no conflict in the way he said it, just two true things sitting together. "I think Papa would have liked him." Evelyn pressed her lips together for a moment. "I think so too." "Then I think you should say yes," Sam said, with the straightforwardness of a 12-year-old who has thought about something carefully and arrived at a conclusion. And Evelyn laughed and then, briefly, had to wipe her eyes, and Sam pretended not to notice, which was a kindness she would remember. The March morning was clear and warm after a week of cold rain, and the whole world had the clean, particular quality of ground that has been thoroughly washed. Evelyn put on her good blue dress and walked up through the new spring grass to the cottonwood tree on the western ridge. She went alone, which felt right. The tree was coming into its first pale green of spring, the buds just beginning to open, and the bark where she had carved Thomas's name was solid and permanent and real. She stood at the tree for a long time, her hand on the bark beside his name. She talked to him, quietly, the way she had occasionally over the years, not to a ghost, but to the person he had been, to the love she still carried. She told him about Harvey. She told him about Sam and the pocket knife. She told him that the apple trees were going to have their best year yet, that the winesap on the south end had put out 3 new strong branches over the winter. She told him that she was not replacing him, that he was not replaceable, that he was in this tree and in this land and in their son's gray-green eyes. She told him she was going to keep living, and that living fully was the only real tribute she knew how to pay. Then she walked down the ridge to the house, saddled her mare, and rode to the double C. Harvey was in the yard working a young horse on a long line when she rode in. He let the horse settle and handed the line to Caleb without a word when he saw her coming, and walked to meet her as she dismounted. She looked at him in the clear spring morning, this steady, patient, honest man who had appeared in her life like something the country had quietly decided she needed, and she felt the full weight of what she was about to say and the rightness of it, 2 things simultaneously. "Yes," she said. He stood very still for a moment, the way he did when he was absorbing something important. Then the not-quite smile became, for the first time she had ever seen, a full and unreserved smile, wide and warm and entirely open, and it changed his face so completely that she laughed with pure surprise and delight. He stepped forward and took both her hands in his. "Yes," he repeated back to her, as if testing the word and finding it perfect. "Spring," she said, smiling up at him. "You said spring." "I said spring," he agreed. Caleb, who was pretending to be completely occupied with the young horse 20 feet away, let out a loud and enthusiastic whoop that he clearly had not entirely planned, and then looked mortified, and Harvey said, "Caleb," without turning around, and Caleb said, "Sorry, Mr. Cooper," and went back to the horse with visible effort at composure, and Evelyn laughed again, and the spring morning went on around them, warm and clear and entirely new. They were married in May of 1879, in the church with the bell that now worked in all weather, on a morning when the cottonwood on the ridge was in full leaf, and the apple trees on the south fence line were in the last of their bloom. Reverend Adcock officiated with a warmth and specificity that told Evelyn he had thought about the words, and the people saying them rather than using a general ceremony, which she appreciated greatly. Sam stood beside Harvey as a witness, at Sam's own insistence, and Harvey's quiet, moved acceptance of the honor. He wore his good shirt again, and held himself with a 13-year-old's careful dignity through the whole service. Bertie Walsh, who had become a genuine friend to Evelyn over the previous 2 years, stood with her. Martha Innes wept enthusiastically in the third pew and made no attempt to be subtle about it, which was so perfectly in character that Evelyn would not have had it any other way. Harvey's vows were in his own words, not the standard text. He had asked Reverend Adcock if that was permissible, and the Reverend had said it was more than permissible. It was preferable. Harvey said that he promised to honor not just Evelyn but the full life she had built and the love she had carried, that he came not to replace anything but to add himself to what already existed, and that he intended to earn her trust every day for the rest of his life. He said this looking directly at her in that steady way, and Evelyn held his gaze and felt every word land in her the way seeds land in good ground, with a certainty of what they would become. She said her own vows with her voice clear and her hand steady in his. She said that she had learned what a good life could be built of not grand gestures but daily work, not ease but the willingness to remain when remaining was difficult, and that she had found in Harvey all those qualities. She said that she brought her whole self to this, her love, her history, her son, her land, her grief, her hope, and she was glad to give them to a man who had shown her she could trust him with all of them. The church was very quiet when she finished. Then Reverend Adcock declared them married, and Harvey Cooper kissed his bride, and Sam clapped harder than anyone in the room, and Martha Innes achieved a new personal record in enthusiastic weeping, and the bell rang out over Harlan's Crossing on a May morning, and everything was different and everything was right. The adjustment of combining 2 lives and a working ranch and a homestead was real work, but it was good work. Harvey moved into Evelyn's house, not the Double C's main house, because Evelyn's house was Thomas's house, and it was Sam's home, and it was where the apple trees were, and Harvey had made this decision without being asked, which told Evelyn more about him than any speech could have. Dade Rourke moved into the main house at the Double C and managed the day-to-day operations with Harvey riding over most mornings. They kept Evelyn's property distinct but connected to the Double C, and this arrangement was practical and also meaningful. The homestead remained hers in name and fact, a continuity that she valued and Harvey understood. He helped with the apple orchard the first autumn as though he had been tending it for years, learning the particularities of each tree from Evelyn with genuine interest, and she found teaching him what she knew about them deeply satisfying, a different kind of intimacy from any she had experienced before. Sam and Harvey found their way carefully, without forcing it. Harvey never tried to be Sam's father, because Sam had a father and they all knew it, and Harvey's instinct to simply be present and reliable and interested was exactly the right approach. He taught Sam things about horses, about cattle, about the specific economic and practical logic of running a ranch. And Sam absorbed these things and gave back in conversation and questions, and occasionally the frank trust of a teenager who needed to talk to an adult who wasn't his mother. In the autumn of their first year of marriage, on a warm September evening, Harvey and Evelyn walked up through the dry grass to the cottonwood tree on the western ridge together, for the first time since she had shown it to him on that July evening before their courtship had fully declared itself. The sun was going down in a slow, spectacular arrangement of orange and rose, and the tree's canopy moved gently in the evening breeze, and Thomas's name in the bark was dark and settled and present as it always was. Evelyn stood with Harvey's hand in hers and looked at the letters carved there, and she thought about that October night in 1873, when she had stood here alone in Thomas's coat with a pocket knife and grief so large she couldn't find the walls of it, and she thought about how much had happened in the years between that night and this one, and how she had carried all of it, and how she was still standing. Harvey reached into his coat pocket. She looked at him, curious. He had his own small pocket knife, a plain, well-used one, and he opened it with the quiet practicality of everything he did. He found a place on the bark beside Thomas's name, not above or below but beside, an equal positioning that was clearly intentional, and he began, carefully and deliberately, to carve his own name into the tree. Harvey Cooper. He carved each letter with the same slow care she had used 6 years before, pressing deep so that it would last. Beside Thomas Dugan's name, beside the place where the grief had been made permanent and visible, Harvey Cooper carved himself into the tree. When he finished, he folded the knife and put it back in his pocket and turned to look at her. Evelyn was weeping, not in the way she had wept on the kitchen floor with the brass button, that desperate, drowning grief. She was weeping in the way a person weeps when something they have longed for without knowing how to name it is suddenly, undeniably real in front of them. She was weeping because he understood. Because he had not asked her to replace or forget or move past, but had simply moved to stand beside Thomas in the bark, beside her in the life she had spent 6 years keeping alive against all odds. Because the gesture was so precisely right that it reached into the place inside her where she had packed away the hope of being fully known by anyone again, and undid the packing, and everything she had stored there came up at once in her chest and required an exit. Harvey put his arms around her, and she let herself be held in the way she had not let herself be held in a very long time completely, without a held-back part of herself standing at a careful distance. She wept into his shoulder while the last of the sunset burned out over the western plain, and the cottonwood tree stood above them with both names in its bark, Thomas and Harvey, present and permanent and real. He held her until she was steady, not trying to stop the crying but simply being there through it, and when she pulled back and looked at the tree again, at both names side by side in the old bark, she felt something resolve in her that had been unresolved for years, not the grief, which would always be there in its quieter form, but the guilt she had not fully admitted to herself, the sense that moving forward was a betrayal, the small cold voice that had sometimes asked her in the dark whether she was forgetting. Whether loving again meant loving less. It did not. She knew it now in the way you know a thing when the right evidence appears at the right moment. The tree held both names and was not diminished by it, was in fact made more itself, more alive, more deeply rooted in the story of the people who had lived on this ridge, and so was she. "Thank you," she said, not entirely certain what she was thanking him for and certain that he would understand anyway. "You don't need to thank me for that," he said quietly. "I know," she said, "but thank you anyway." They stood at the tree until the dark came fully in and the stars appeared above the cottonwood canopy, and then they walked down through the night grass together, hand in hand, back to the house where the lamp in the kitchen window made a warm orange square in the dark, and Sam had left the door unlatched for them. The years that followed were full in the way that a life well lived tends to be full, not without difficulty, but layered and textured with things that mattered. The Double C grew under Harvey's management, expanding carefully and without overextension, and became one of the most respected small ranching operations in the county. Evelyn's apple orchard reached its full maturity and produced fruit of such quality and quantity that she began selling a portion of each harvest to the general store and to a hotel in the nearest large town, a modest but satisfying income that was entirely her own. Bertie Walsh stayed in Harlan's Crossing, having found her footing and then her heart in the territory she had been so uncertain about, and married a quiet, decent man who ran the feed store, and she and Evelyn remained close friends through the years in the way that genuine friendship, once established, tends toward permanence. In the late autumn of 1880, Evelyn told Harvey one morning over coffee that there was going to be a child. Harvey went very still in the way he went still for important things, and then he set down his cup and took her hand across the table and looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she thought her heart might simply expand beyond its housing. "How are you?" he asked, meaning 100 things. "I am very well," she said, meaning all of them back. Sam told the news that Sunday, went through a complex emotional passage that Evelyn recognized as 13 years old, confronting the reality that family was not a fixed and finished thing, but a living arrangement that continued to change. He came out the other side of it faster than she expected, arriving at a genuine and characteristic directness. "I'll teach it how to ride," he said firmly, as if this had been the primary concern and was now settled. Harvey said that that was an excellent plan, and that he hoped Sam would start the child young, because a person who learns to ride early has a structural advantage in life that cannot be overstated. Sam agreed with complete seriousness, and Evelyn had to look at a point above both their heads to manage the smile. The boy was born in June of 1881, on a hot morning when the apple trees were heavy with green fruit, and the cicadas were already loud in the cottonwoods. He arrived with the full-voiced announcement of a person who has opinions about his arrival, a robust and healthy cry that brought Harvey through the door so fast he nearly knocked into Dr. Pell, who was still attending births in Harlan's Crossing at an advanced age and with a dignity that would not be jostled. They named him William Thomas Cooper. William for Harvey's father, dead 10 years, whom Harvey had spoken of with quiet reverence on a handful of occasions that told Evelyn how much he carried the man's memory. Thomas for a reason that did not need to be explained. Harvey held his son for the first time with the careful, absorbed intensity of a man encountering something unprecedented. William, red-faced and opinionated, stared up at his father with the ancient, unfocused clarity of the newborn, and Harvey said something to him very quietly, too quiet for Evelyn to hear, and whatever it was private and complete. Sam held his half-brother that afternoon with the exaggerated care of a 14-year-old who has been told to be careful and is taking the instruction with full seriousness, and he looked down at William's small, screwed-up face and said, "Hello," in a tone of grave and genuine welcome, and William promptly went to sleep, which Sam took as the highest compliment. The child grew in the way that second children grow in a house already stretched and warmed by previous living, easily surrounded, soaking up the noise and attention and love of two parents and an older brother, and the whole extended community of hands and neighbors that made up the world of Harlan's Crossing. Sam turned 16 and began working proper days on the Double C alongside Harvey and the Rourke brothers, having reached an age and size where the work was available to him, and the interest had never flagged. He was becoming a man with the combination of his mother's precision and his father's, Thomas's, easy warmth, and something new too, something that was simply Sam, forged in the particular fire of his particular life. He still went up to the cottonwood tree sometimes, alone, which Evelyn knew without comment and which she understood. In the spring of 1883, something happened that Evelyn had not anticipated, which was that a man came to town claiming to be the rightful heir to a portion of the land on which Harlan's Crossing sat, including land that touched on both Evelyn's homestead and the Double C's northern boundary. His name was Preston Cole, no relation to the cattle broker Garrett Cole from years before, though the coincidence of name was not lost on Evelyn, and he had a document of questionable provenance and a lawyer from San Antonio, and a manner of aggrieved certainty that some people found persuasive and others found immediately suspicious. Harvey dealt with it. This is the short version. The longer version is that Harvey, who has established no more land law than he had ever wanted to, spent 3 weeks examining Preston Cole's claim against every available county record and surveying document, and determined through meticulous work, with help from the county clerk, a thorough man named Aldridge who approached the question with relish, that Cole's document was not a forgery exactly, but was a misrepresented partial deed that did not convey what Cole claimed it conveyed. He presented this finding to the local magistrate with the same composed directness he brought to all things, and Preston Cole's lawyer, facing evidence rather than bluster, advised his client to reconsider his prospects and they left Harlan's Crossing on the San Antonio stage without further incident. Evelyn had watched the whole proceeding with the pride she had learned to feel on Harvey's behalf, a full and unambiguous pride, the kind that doesn't hedge. And when it was over and they were sitting on the porch together in the spring evening, she said, "You are formidable, Harvey Cooper, when there is something worth defending." He looked at her sideways in that way he had. "I learned that from someone," he said. She thought of Cole the cattle broker, years before, and herself reading the offer at the kitchen table and deciding without hesitation that the land was not hers to give away. "I suppose you did," she said. William, who was 2 and entirely mobile and had opinions about everything including the stars, chose that moment to appear at the porch door, having somehow exited the house through the kitchen in the brief window of Caleb's inattention, and stood on the porch with his father's expression of calm determination and his mother's dark hair, and said, "Up," to Harvey with the confident expectation of someone accustomed to being accommodated. Harvey lifted him without interrupting his thoughts, settled the boy on his knee, and said, "What do you think about the stars, William?" William looked at the sky with the seriousness of the very young. "Big," he said finally. "Very big," Harvey agreed, and put an arm around Evelyn on the bench. And the three of them sat in the warm spring night with the stars coming in big above the ridge and the cottonwood tree, a dark shape against the sky, and the apple orchard along the south fence, exhaling the faint, sweet smell of blossoms that had just opened that week. Sam came home from the Double C at that late hour, having stayed to help Dade with a mare who had been having trouble and was now settled and well, and he took in the porch scene and said, "Did William escape again?" And Evelyn said, "He did," and Sam said to William, "We really need to discuss the terms of your confinement," and William said, "No," which was currently his second favorite word after "up," and Sam laughed and sat on the porch steps, and they stayed out there, all 4 of them, until the night was properly dark and William had fallen asleep against Harvey's chest with the perfect trust of a child who has never known what it is to fall. The summer of 1884 was the summer the photographs were taken. A traveling photographer came through Harlan's Crossing in July, a dignified man from back east named Cornelius Watts, who had been making his way through the Texas towns with his equipment wagon, offering portraits and family photographs at a reasonable rate. The whole town was mildly electrified by this, photographs being still enough of an event to constitute a social occasion. Evelyn had her portrait taken, a formal one, standing straight in her good blue dress that she had been married in, now mended at one shoulder and taken in slightly at the waist from the changes of the years. She looked at the resulting photograph when it was developed and felt strange about it in the way a person feels strange about seeing their own face, the objective record of how they appear in the world, and then she looked at it again and thought, "This is a woman who has lived." There was something in the eyes, a quality of being present and awake, that she had not been looking for and found anyway. Harvey had his taken, and he looked in his photograph like he looked in life, composed, slightly amused in some interior way, and entirely himself, which Evelyn told him, and he accepted with characteristic modesty. The family photograph was the one Evelyn kept. Harvey and Evelyn sitting in the yard chairs that Cornelius Watts arranged with careful attention to composition, Sam standing behind with his hand on the back of his mother's chair, 16 years old and nearly a man, wearing his good shirt for the 3rd or 4th great occasion of his life, and William in Evelyn's lap, having been talked into sitting still for the necessary period through a combination of negotiation and a piece of cornbread that he held throughout, and that is visible in the photograph, which Evelyn always thought was perfect. She put the photograph on the mantelpiece beside the small brass button she had found in her sewing basket the month after Thomas died, which she had kept there for 11 years as a particular kind of marker, and looking at both things together, the button and the family photograph, she felt the full arc of what had happened, from that kitchen floor where she had sat and wept to this mantelpiece, to this house, to this life, and the feeling was not triumphant, because grief is not something you triumph over. It is something you carry and fold into yourself until it becomes part of your structure rather than a wound. But it was full and true, and she was grateful in a way that had no single object, only the general, uncontainable gratitude of being alive and loved. That autumn, Evelyn took both her children, William 3 years old and clutching her hand, Sam on his horse, alongside up to the cottonwood tree on the western ridge on the afternoon of the anniversary of Thomas's death. She had done this every year since the first, alone or with Sam when he was old enough to understand. This was the first year she had done it differently. Harvey stayed at the bottom of the ridge. She had not asked him to, but he had understood without being told that this was a different kind of visit, a family visit, and he had simply said he would check on the south fence and be back in an hour, which was exactly what she needed. Sam stood at the tree with the ease of someone who had been here many times, and William looked at the bark with the investigative focus of a 3-year-old encountering something large and old and textured. He ran his hands over the bark and found, by pure navigation of a small child following whatever is interesting, the carved letters. He traced them with his finger, looking at them with the serious attention he brought to new information. "What is that?" he asked. "Names," Sam said, coming to crouch beside his little brother. "See, this is Thomas Dugan." He traced the letters slowly. "That was our father before you were born, before I was as big as you." William looked at the letters and then at Sam. "Our father, your grandfather, sort of," Sam said, thinking through it in the practical way he had. "My father. And then this one," he moved William's small hand to the second set of letters. "That's Harvey Cooper, our father now. The one at home." William looked at the two names side by side in the bark of the old tree, tracing both with his finger. "Both," he said. "Both," Sam agreed. Evelyn stood behind them, watching her two children at the tree, the boy who had his father Thomas's eyes and the small boy who had Harvey's composed and deliberate way of taking in new information. And she felt the tree above her, the deep root of it, the names in the bark, and the whole long thread of things. And she wept not with grief, not exactly, but with the overwhelming reality of love in its full and complex form. Love that holds loss and continuation and gratitude all at once and does not distinguish between them, because they are not distinct but the same substance in different lights. Sam heard her and turned around and stood up and simply put his arm around his mother's shoulders without a word, which was 16 years of learning compressed into a single gesture. And she leaned into him, and they stood at the tree together in the October afternoon, the 4 of them, or 5, counting the name in the bark, and the cottonwood spread its branches above them in the last of the season's warmth. Harvey came back up the ridge while they were still standing there, and when he saw the picture of it, Sam with his arm around Evelyn, William sitting at the base of the tree with his hands on the carved names, he stopped at a distance for a moment, and then Evelyn looked up and saw him and extended her hand, and he walked the rest of the way up the ridge and took it. She drew him forward, and he stood with them at the tree and looked at the two names in the bark as he had looked at them on the night he had carved his own, and she thought about what he had said then, "He is here." And she thought, yes, he is, and so are we. In the years that continued after that autumn afternoon, life accumulated its days the way a river accumulates its miles, not dramatically mostly, but with an insistence that makes a country out of what started as bare ground. Sam fell in love at 18 with a girl from a farming family 40 miles south, a sharp-minded young woman named Clara Hewitt who could argue in 3 directions at once and matched Sam in stubbornness and equaled him in warmth. And Evelyn liked her immediately and unreservedly, which Harvey said was the most important endorsement possible. They married in the fall of 1886, and Sam took over the management of Evelyn's homestead formally, having been doing it in practice for 2 years already, and the new couple moved into the house with the intention of building their own addition on the east side within a year, which they did. Evelyn and Harvey moved to the Double C's main house, which Harvey had been improving steadily for years, and which was by 1886 a proper and well-built home, large enough for a family and a future. The apple orchard remained Evelyn's. She kept it with the same meticulous care she always had, and now that she had more time she expanded it, adding 6 new trees in 1887, 2 new varieties she had been corresponding about with her friend in Bixar County for 2 years, and the orchard was 20 trees, and producing a harvest that supplied not only the local store but a market in 2 additional towns, a modest enterprise that had grown from a grief planting into a real operation, in which Evelyn ran with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has built something from love and watched it become something else that is still love. William grew up on the Double C and on the homestead simultaneously, the product of both places, and he had the best of several inheritances: Harvey's steady patience and practical intelligence, Evelyn's precision and depth of feeling, the particular groundedness of a child who has been loved by 2 men and a woman with different kinds of excellence, and the whole wide country of Central Texas as the condition of his growing. He was, at 7, the most serious small person Evelyn had ever encountered, with a quality of attention that occasionally surprised adults who expected children to be diffuse. He had strong opinions about horses, about which apple varieties were the best for eating versus cooking, about the proper way to read the weather sky, and about Sam's dog, whose name was General, and who William had decided years ago was actually his own. The dog was officially Sam's, but spent 2/3 of its time at the Double C, which everyone had gradually accepted as the natural order. In the spring of 1888, Harvey and Evelyn sat on the porch of the Double C's main house on an evening that smelled of apple blossoms carried on the south wind from Evelyn's orchard, and Evelyn told Harvey that she expected there would be another child in the autumn. He was 45 years old and she was 43, and they both knew this was later than conventional and also exactly as it was, and Harvey took her hand and held it for a moment and looked at the south wind carrying the apple blossoms and said, "I am the most fortunate man I have ever known." "Don't let Sam or Caleb hear you say that," Evelyn said. "They'll both argue the point on their own behalf." He laughed, the full laugh, the one she had first seen on the morning she had ridden to the Double C in March of 1879, and said yes, the one that changed his face entirely and was still one of her favorite things in the world to cause. She leaned against his shoulder and they watched the spring evening come in over the land, their land, the orchard and the ridge and the cottonwood trees silhouette against the sky. The child born in October of 1888 was a girl. They named her Annabelle Evelyn Cooper, and she arrived with dark eyes that would lighten to a warm brown as she grew, and a quality of watchful observation from her very first days that made Evelyn think of Harvey's way of taking in the world and feel a pure gladness she could not measure. William, 7 years old and accustomed to being the subject of everyone's attention, regarded his sister with the careful evaluation of a person making a genuine assessment, and then, on the second morning of her existence, declared that she was fine, which from William at 7 was a comprehensive endorsement, and everyone received it as such. Sam came with Clara the day Annabelle was born, and Clara, who was herself 4 months along with her own first child, held baby Annabelle with the particular tenderness of a woman who is also waiting, and Sam watched his half-sister's small face with an expression Evelyn recognized as his father Thomas's expression of quiet certainty, and she was so moved by it that she had to look at the wall for a moment. Clara and Sam's son was born in the late spring of 1889, a loud and vigorous boy they named Thomas Henry Dugan, Thomas for his grandfather and Henry for Clara's own father, and the continuation of the name in the next generation was a thing that Evelyn received with a gratitude she carried privately for a long time after. The summer of 1889 was the summer that the cottonwood tree on the western ridge, that great old tree, enormous and deep-rooted and patient, put out such a profusion of seed cotton that the whole ridge looked in midsummer as if it were under a gentle snow, white seeds drifting in every direction on the warm July wind. Evelyn stood at the fence line watching it with William at her side and Annabelle on her hip, and William said, with his characteristic gravity, "It's doing that on purpose." "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked. "The tree," William said. "It's spreading, it wants there to be more trees." Evelyn looked at her son, this serious small boy, and then at the white seeds drifting south on the summer air. "Maybe it does," she said. "If a seed lands in good ground it becomes a new tree," William said, working it out as he spoke. "And then that tree grows and does the same thing, and then there are 100 trees where there was one." "That's exactly right," Evelyn said. William thought about this for a moment. "I think we should make sure one lands somewhere it can grow," he said. "Near the house maybe, or near the apple orchard." She looked down at him, this child of hers, this extraordinary small person, and she thought about seeds and trees and names carved in bark and love that grows from one place into many, and she said, "I think that is a very good idea." They found a place along the south side of the apple orchard fence where the soil was deep and the water table was good. And later that week, they gathered some of the seed cotton carefully, William holding the seeds with the seriousness of someone conducting important work, and planted 3 seeds in the turned earth, and marked the spots with small stones, and watered them, and waited. 2 of the 3 germinated. Harvey found the 2 small seedlings in August, and stood looking at them with his hands in his pockets, and a quality of recognition on his face that did not require any commentary. He looked up at Evelyn, who was standing a few paces back watching him, and said, "William's project." "William's idea," she said. "My execution." "They'll take 20 years to be anything," Harvey said, not as a criticism but as an observation of the timeline. "Most things worth having do," Evelyn said. He looked at the seedlings for another moment. "He'll be 27 when they're real trees." "He will," she said, "and his children will be able to sit under them." Harvey walked back to her and put his arm around her waist, and they stood together in the late summer afternoon looking at the 2 small seedlings by the apple orchard fence, the beginning of trees that would take 2 decades to become fully themselves, which was fine because there was no hurry, because the time they had was long and good and full of living, and the seeds were in the ground and the ground was holding them, and the future was simply what came next, season by season, as it always had been and always would be. In September of that year, on a Sunday afternoon when the harvest had been brought in, and the autumn air had that particular crispness that edges toward winter without arriving yet, Evelyn walked up to the cottonwood tree on the western ridge one more time. She did this every October around the anniversary of Thomas's death, and she expected to continue doing it for the rest of her life. But this time something pulled her earlier in the season, on a day with no particular significance except that it was beautiful and quiet, and she had an afternoon to herself, while Harvey was at the Double C, and William was at Sam and Clara's place making the acquaintance of his new nephew Thomas Henry, and Annabelle was asleep in the house in the care of Clara's mother. She walked up through the dry September grass alone, the way she had walked it the first time 16 years ago, though everything else was different now. The weight of the coat around her shoulders was her own. The pocket knife in her pocket was Harvey's that she carried out of habit and some small inheritance of his practicality. The sky was high and pale blue with the first suggestion of autumn in the clouds, and the cottonwood tree was gold and green at the top where the leaves were beginning to turn. She found the names in the bark and put both hands on the tree, one on each name, the way you might put your hands on 2 shoulders. Thomas Dugan, Harvey Cooper. The grief that lived in her was old and familiar now, not an absence that screamed but a presence that spoke quietly, the way a fire in a hearth speaks warm and real, and the condition of the room rather than a disruption of it. She had learned over 16 years that grief and love were the same element in different states of being, that she could love Thomas still and love Harvey fully, and the 2 did not compete because love was not a finite resource but a practice, a daily renewal of attention and care, and she had been practicing it in one form or another for most of her life. She looked at the two names side by side in the old bark, and she thought about that night Harvey had carved his name there, how she had wept, how the weeping had felt like something releasing that had been held for years, how he had held her without trying to fix the tears. She thought about what the tree held now. Two names, two men, two loves, the full complexity of a life lived honestly, not one story ending and another beginning, but all of it continuous, all of it hers. The leaves overhead moved in the dry autumn wind and scattered their early gold against the blue sky, and the whole ridge smelled of grass and distance and the coming cold. And Evelyn Dugan Cooper stood at the tree with her hands on both names and said, as was her habit, Thomas's name aloud once, to the good air and the wide sky. And then she said Harvey's name too, just to say it, because he was part of this place now just as Thomas was, and the tree held both of them, and the tree was rooted in the same earth that she was rooted in, and the roots went down a long way into the ground of everything that had made her, and they were strong, and they would hold. She walked back down the ridge in the long afternoon light, back through the gold grass, back toward the house where the lamp would need lighting soon, where Annabelle would wake and need feeding, where Harvey would come home at the end of the day from the double C with the smell of horses and dust and autumn on him, and would say something ordinary, and she would answer, and they would be in the particular country of two people who have built a life together, and know its geography and love it in the way you love a place you have chosen entirely for yourself. She was 44 years old, and she had been a wife, a widow, a mother, a homesteader, an orchardist, a neighbor, and a wife again. And she had been fully and precisely herself through all of it, and she was still and always exactly herself. The house came into view below the ridge, solid and warm in the September light, the apple orchard along the south fence still deep green with just the first edges of gold, the two small cottonwood seedlings invisible at this distance but there, in the ground, growing. She reached the porch and sat down for just a moment in the chair that still held the shape of her preferred way of sitting in it, and looked back up at the ridge where the big tree was just visible against the sky, and she thought, this is the life. Not the life she had planned, not the life that came without cost, not the life that asked nothing of her, but the life she had loved into being, loss and all, and it was real and it was good and it was hers. Harvey rode in through the gate at the end of the afternoon with the easy authority of a man who has come home to where he wanted to be, and his horse's hooves on the dry ground made the sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat, and she stood up from the chair as he dismounted, and he came to her and kissed her in the plain, complete way of a man who has been doing this for 10 years and intends to do it for 40 more, and she received it in the plain, complete way of a woman who intends the same. Annabelle woke inside and made the preliminary sounds of waking hunger, and Harvey raised an eyebrow in the direction of the sound, with the wordless parental communication of two people in the middle of an ordinary and extraordinary life, and Evelyn laughed and went inside, and the evening came in over the ridge and the cottonwood tree, and the two small seedlings growing in the good ground by the apple orchard fence, and the lamps went on in the house one by one as the dark came. Warm against the large and patient dark of the Texas evening, present and enduring and alive.